Thanks everyone for joining. We will get started shortly. We are recording this session and it will be available after the presentation. Hi everyone, welcome to the briefing room for the third in a series of ClimateWorks webinars, an event entitled Industry Transitions. My name is Rob Kelly. I lead the Pathways Investment Program here at ClimateWorks Australia, which encompasses our work with Australian industry. You can find out more about ClimateWorks at climateworksaustralia.org. At the moment, I'm working on the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative, a program that will support Australian industry in hard to abate sectors towards the achievement of net zero emissions by 2050, while managing the transition to thrive in a decarbonised global economy. It is an independent Australian initiative jointly convened by ClimateWorks Australia and Climate Kick Australia in collaboration with the Energy Transitions Commission. Aiming to support industry to develop pathways and actions in alignment with net zero emissions across critical supply chains of the Australian economy. Before we introduce our speakers this afternoon, I would like to acknowledge that today is the start of National Reconciliation Week, held this year under the theme, In This Together. I acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands the ClimateWorks office is located. I pay my respect to the traditional owners and their elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you all for sharing this time with us. A reminder that those of you who have registered via Zoom will receive an email afterwards with links to resources mentioned in the discussion. Make sure you check your inbox and your spam folder in case it ends up there. We are running this event as a panel. Our two special guests will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then there'll be plenty of time for you to ask them questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our team will collate and they will put them to our guests as we go along. I would now like to introduce you to Anna Skarbek, the CEO of ClimateWorks Australia, who will host the event today. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to see you and our guests on the screen and to hear from our audience through the chat functions and the other ways that Rob has mentioned. I'm very proud to be the CEO of ClimateWorks Australia, which, as many of you will know, is an expert independent advisory organisation committed to helping Australia transition to net zero emissions by 2050. Many of you will also know that ClimateWorks recently published a major report entitled Decarbonisation Futures that showed that viable paths to zero emissions exist for all major economic sectors in Australia if technology deployment is rapidly accelerated. That document has provided the context for the webinars we've hosted so far in this series. One with our ClimateWorks Head of National Programs, Amandine Dennis, and Senior Project Manager Tom Yankas, on an overview of decarbonisation futures and its key findings, and another with Paul Graham, Chief Economist at CSIRO, and Rob Coe from Morgan Stanley that looked specifically at energy transitions. Those two discussions were recorded, just as this one will be, and you can check it all out on our past webinars on the ClimateWorks website. So we're going to keep this series going, and after today's one, we'll have our next one focused on transport transitions, which is scheduled for the 10th of June, a fortnight from today. That one will involve EV Council CEO Behar Jafari and Australia Post's National Fleet Manager across Transport and Aviation, Terry Bickerton. So look out for that one. But for now, without further ado, let's get underway with today's one. We're very fortunate to have with us two very expert guests for this topic of industry transitions. Our first guest joining us from the UK is Lord Adair Turner. He chairs the Energy Transitions Commission, a global coalition of major power and industrial companies, investors, environmental NGOs and experts working out achievable pathways towards net zero emissions in the harder to abate sectors to limit global warming. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, chairman of Chubb Europe, and was the UK's first chair of its Climate Change Committee, and a former chair of the UK Pensions Commission and the UK Financial Services Authority. And for 5 years, he ran the CBI, the UK equivalent of our Business Council. So I know you'll join me in welcoming Adair in a moment. Following Adair will be our second guest, Tennant Reid. Tennant is a Principal National Advisor of Public Policy at the Australian Industry Group, where he works on climate and energy issues, as well as manufacturing and innovation. Previously, he was an advisor in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, working on fiscal policy, stimulus and infrastructure. Thank you both. I'm sure, like me, the audience will realise we have two superb guests for today's topic and for the times, given the relevance of both of your expertise to the issues surrounding us around transitions and stimulus. So I'm going to introduce each of our guests to make some introductory remarks for about 5 minutes, and then I'll lead a discussion where I'll pose some questions for discussion, but also I'll look forward to asking questions that come in from all of our viewers via the Zoom. So as Rob said, if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask something at any time you want, and I'll rely on our trusty staff behind the scenes to collate those for me to draw from in our discussion. So to kick things off, I now ask Adair to share your perspectives with us for 5 minutes or so. Thank you, Adair.
Anna, thank you very much indeed, and it's a great pleasure to be with whoever I'm with. I can't see you all, but hope that we will soon be back to being able to meet in person, but this is a good way to communicate in the meantime. Anna and Rob have asked me to talk a little bit about both the Energy Transition Commission and the path to net zero of industry, but also has that changed as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and the need to recover from that crisis? And the answer is, at one level, not fundamentally, though it's an issue that we've been thinking about as much as possible over the last month or so. I mean, the background is that the Energy Transition Commission set out a report 18 months ago now called Mission Possible, which sets out the path to a net zero in all of what we call the hard to abate sectors of the economy, which include both industrial sectors like steel and cement and petrochemicals, and to a lesser extent aluminium. Aluminium's a bit easier, and also long distance transport sectors like shipping and aviation. And we argued then that it was absolutely possible for even those hard sectors of the economy to get to net zero by 2050 across the world, and that the impact of that on end consumer living standards was very low indeed, and easily affordable. So at one level, what has changed? In some senses not. The fundamental technologies by which we go from here to a zero carbon economy have not changed. In steel production, it's still about, do you apply carbon capture and storage to an existing coking coal-based steel production process, or do you use hydrogen as the reduction agent? In petrochemicals and the production of plastics, it's still about, can we move to a much more recycled plastics economy? Can we use biomass as an input to plastics? Can we change plastics production processes? To which the answer is yes, we can, at a reasonably low cost. And what is interesting is that a lot of those basics have not changed. And before and during and still this crisis, we have been working closely in a joint venture with the World Economic Forum, and on a sector by sector basis, in steel, in cement, in aviation, in shipping, to say what are the specific measures which will get us to net zero. For instance, in the steel sector, we're working very closely with the European steel sector to orchestrate and get commitments to net zero European steel by 2050, to be announced ahead of COP26. But as we've been doing this, we, at an early stage in this COVID-19 crisis, said, well, we can't just ignore what has happened in the world. There has been a large event with a very large impact on the economies, all of our economies. Has it changed? Does it change the context? Does it change the context either in a difficult direction or in a way that creates opportunities to both drive recovery from the economic crisis and pursue this necessary net zero agenda? So we have been also working over the last 2 months in producing another document, which we've called 7 Priorities to Help the Global Economy Recover, trying to think through which are the policies which could help the recovery of the crisis, from the crisis, but also drive us towards net zero. Now, it's true to say that many of those do not directly relate to heavy industry. And they don't relate because they relate actually more to things like transport. I won't invade that area in detail, but it's quite an interesting point, at least across Europe, that we have gone through a very interesting process on transport in the middle of this crisis. First, we've had people being aware of how beautiful our cities can be when there are no longer internal combustion engines in them. Secondly, we are coming out of this crisis with people a little bit worried about getting into mass public transport systems, into the London Tube subway system, because of health concerns. And that is actually inducing across the whole of Europe an acceleration of the introduction of pedestrian areas, cycling areas, electric mobility, reinforcement of the progress towards the electrification of the auto. And so we are seeing in transport, I think, really quite a tipping point in a sense, a favorable tipping point in the long term, in the sense of committing to the electrification of our surface transport systems. And there was a big announcement and an important announcement by President Macron there yesterday. So there are some sectors where actually I think policy has changed quite a bit. But what has changed for heavy industry? I would say 2 or 3 things. One, the cost of capital across the world, the cost at which you can borrow money, has done 2 rather interesting things. One, the rates of real free interest rates have come thumping down. What government can borrow money at is got very low indeed. But secondly, the risk premium that some companies have to pay to borrow money has gone up. And that raises some really interesting issues about the role of government support and government balance sheets to help transitions to a zero carbon economy. The other thing which of course has happened is a collapse of fossil fuel prices, oil particularly, but also to a degree gas and coal. And of course that tends to make zero carbon technologies for a time look somewhat less economic because you've changed the relative effects of that. We have also seen in countries which have a carbon price regimes, a fall in the carbon price, because when you get a fall in economic activity, there isn't as much competition to buy carbon permits in, for instance, the European emission trading scheme. So the price immediately went down. So we were very aware in the industrial sector that this crisis might lead to people saying, well, you know, I'm going to pull back from progress towards a zero carbon a pathway because my fossil fuels look a bit cheaper, the carbon price is lower. And also, obviously, we have had steel and cement companies and petrochemical companies whose tendency has been to say, you know, I've got to focus on short-term survival and profitability, not the long term. But I think actually the good news, and I'll end with this, and then we can explore this in more detail, is that in talking to all the major companies that we're dealing with, that has not occurred. There has, if anything, been an absolute reinforcement of the belief that they are going to head towards net zero, and that they've got to keep going through this crisis. And that has been true both of policymakers and of companies. In terms of policymakers, certainly in Europe and in the UK, there has been, during this crisis, a clear reinforcement of the idea, well, the recovery from the crisis has got to be green. The UK is leaving the European Union, but in this respect, there is no difference at all between the European Union and the UK. And indeed, if anything, we are seeing a reinforcement of things like carbon pricing. The fall in the carbon prices within the European Union was offset by actions taken by the European Union to make sure that the price fall was reversed. And there is a very clear price signal coming forward to the heavy industrial sectors in Europe. And in the UK, there is a significant amount of talk by the UK government about strengthening unilaterally our carbon price regime, which I think will continue to be as strong as Europe's. And really the focus of heavy industry, and I will end on this, of who we're working with in the steel industry in Europe now, is not about arguing against a carbon price, but arguing that there has to be protection against the international competitiveness impacts of a carbon price. And that means applying what's called border tax adjustments to enable you to put in place a carbon tax domestically while making sure that you are not vulnerable to parts of the world which haven't done the same. And I think we will see in Europe this crisis leading to an acceleration of approach towards stronger carbon prices, but with protection for heavy industry to make sure that they are protected against the competitive effects of that from elsewhere. I have also been recently spending a lot of my time not in China, virtually in China. I was spending a lot of my time in China last year in reality. I now spend a lot of my time in virtual, and we are spending time talking to the Chinese heavy industry and policymakers about their attitude to this. Now, obviously, it's difficult to persuade the Chinese immediately to move to carbon pricing, but the European attitude is going to be, well, if they don't, there are going to be simply tariffs against Chinese, or in fact in the steel industry, the crucial thing in Europe is Russian or Turkish imports into Europe. So we are seeing no slowdown in the determination. We are seeing in the transport sectors and actually also in the power sectors, if anything, an acceleration of plans to head towards zero carbon. In the heavy industry sectors, we are seeing no deceleration, but an increasing focus on this nexus of issues that relate to carbon prices and border tax adjustments. And finally, in technology, I think we're seeing some really interesting recent announcements in the hydrogen space. I think underlying this crisis, there is an increasing realization, and it's just continuing there, that the price of renewable electricity is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and the price of getting hydrogen is getting cheaper and cheaper. I noticed two things to mention recent announcements. The lowest cost solar PV in the world, an auction in Abu Dhabi at 1.35 US cents per kilowatt hour. And if you can do that in Abu Dhabi, you can do that in the middle of the Australian desert as well. So we are seeing in the most favorable parts of the world stunningly low prices for solar PV, and we know that that's going to continue. And we are seeing also stunningly low prices for offshore wind developments in Europe, in the North Sea. And we are seeing a collapsing price of producing electrolyzers and producing hydrogen. And the reason why that matters, talking about industry, is that hydrogen can be a crucial part of the decarbonization of heavy industry, as well as some of the automotive sectors. The other announcements that we've seen is a big announcement in the North Sea of a combined project to invest in offshore wind, to turn it into hydrogen, and to put that into ships leaving the North Sea to go to the rest of the world, picking up their hydrogen from hydrogen production centres out next to offshore wind renewable energy production. This is a joint venture between Maersk, the biggest container shipping company in the world, which is committed to be zero carbon by 2050, and Ørsted, one of the biggest offshore wind companies in the world. And I simply mention that along with the Abu Dhabi thing to say this process, this commitment to net zero has not gone away at all in the crisis. In some ways it's been reinforced, in some ways it's subtly changed and amended the nature of the policies that we need to drive it, but underlying it, the technology progress and the business actions which will take us to net zero are continuing amid this crisis and will drive forward as we come out of it. I hope those comments are useful to get us going in the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, they are extremely, Adair. Thank you. I'm absolutely sure that was really rich for everyone in the audience, and I want to thank you for being able to bring those multiple perspectives to us and to give up your early morning to do so. And so thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to unpacking some of that in the discussion, and in particular many aspects which are relevant to Australia. And to bring our focus to Australia, we're going to hear first from our other panellist, Tennant Reid. And remember, if there were any questions that you want to ask Adair, you can post those in the Q&A function. And if you think of more while Tennant is talking and to bring it into the Australian focus, again, use the Q&A function, and then I'll kick off the discussion. We've got more than enough to get us started. So as I mentioned earlier, Tennant Reid from the Australian Industry Group. AIG has thousands of industrial members, companies in Australia that work across the industry spectrum in manufacturing and other sectors. And so I'm looking forward to hearing Tennant's perspective to complement Adair's references to the multiple industry sectors that he's been working with globally. So over to you, Tennant. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So yeah, AI Group is a body that represents businesses of all sizes, many sectors, lots of manufacturing, but which is a diverse sector itself, but also construction, technology, defence, energy, labour hire. There's a lot of sectors there. What members want is, in some ways, as diverse as they are, but the common threads in the work that we do with them and the feedback that we get from them in this area are they seek long-term and short-term competitiveness. They seek success on climate. There are more and more businesses with explicit statements about their pursuit of net zero emissions, whether that's within their own operations or in the wider economy. Pathways for them to adjust to that. And we've seen, I think, a lot of focus and a lot of progress in pathways for the electricity generation sector, and it is very much time for Australia to broaden its horizons to what do we do in the rest of the economy. Electricity generation is only about 1/3 of our current national emissions. And in that respect, we're very proud to be an active observer and a supporter of the Industry Energy Transition Initiative that ClimateWorks and Climate Kick have kicked off and referred to, and even happier that some of our leading members are a part of that initiative too. As well as the pathways and businesses are actively investing in their time and money in how do they chart those pathways. They need investability for the solutions themselves to be able to put big sums of money into walking those pathways. And that remains a policy and a market design challenge for Australia. We have at our group have set we've adopted and endorsed the goal of net zero emissions for Australia by 2050, and we would like to pair that with a goal and a vision of global competitive advantage for Australia in a net zero emissions world. That kind of vision it's achievable, it is challenging, it's something that can really focus us as we, for instance, think about how to implement the technology roadmap that the federal government has laid out a draft of in the past week, and to pursue the refinements to policy mechanisms in the King Review recommendations. Those sorts of, that menu of options and that set of improved tools need an organising vision to steer them, and we think that net zero is an excellent and challenging mission to apply there. The state of play of our economy right now is oddly, because things, I would say, a month or 6 weeks ago looked like we were on a precipice whose depths could not be seen. Right now, if we hadn't had that experience, current economic conditions would look historically dire, but they look almost reassuring compared to what we thought was happening just a short while ago. Now, members report to us both that absolute activity in the manufacturing sector in particular is at its lowest level since the depths of the global financial crisis. We've had the steepest fall in activity in the 28 years that we've collected our monthly survey of the performance of manufacturing. But members are telling us, well, you know, we have some concerns about demand, but it's not looking quite as bad for us as we thought it was. The chances are, though, that we are going to see multiple waves of economic impact as the slowdown in consumption and in investment in different pieces of the economy filters through supply chains to slowdowns and stoppages in the work that is on the books of a wider circle of companies, and there's the potential for a widening ripple of slowdown to be self-sustaining. And it's very important that we avoid that, and that we make reforms and investments to both recover from the immediate slowdown and to build strength for our long-term economy. So in that regard, our group and our members have been very active on this question of the overlap between economic recovery and energy transition. We've done a number of things in that regard. I'd agree with Adair's assessment of some of the ways in which the crisis has made transition both harder in terms of private investment and the cost of capital, and easier in terms of the public cost of capital. One respect in which it hasn't changed things is while we are seeing a dip in emissions in all economies at the moment, certainly including Australia, and if we focus solely on something like the current Australian nationally determined contribution of a 2030 target, 26 to 28%, any point target like that or any carbon budget gets easier to meet with a slowdown or recession like what we're currently seeing. But that slowdown doesn't of itself make the end point of a successful transition to prosperity at net zero emissions any easier. It doesn't put in place any of the technological changes, practice changes, investments needed to get there. And so it is important that we lift our sights up from the what the numbers are doing right now to are we heading to the destination that we need to get to. So just briefly, what we've been doing is both publicly emphasising the importance of this zone of overlap between what can help us recover faster and what can build the long-term transition. We've been working with members and other organisations on what are the options that can actually fulfil that vision. And we've been encouraging all levels of government to work in that space. Most recently, we and 14 other organisations issued a statement on Monday of this week saying that we need to accelerate that transition to net zero emissions through our recovery activity, and highlighting demand-side energy efficiency and energy management as one big area that can advance that. Certainly not the only one, but an area of great consensus. And in terms of its impacts on heavy industry supplies a lot of building products. It supplies a lot of consumer appliances that can be, new ones can be more efficient and more controllable than a lot of what is already in households. The range of upgrades that we could make to our built environment across industrial sites, commercial property, residential, public and private housing, whether that's single family or multi-unit, there's an enormous range of upgrades that we could make that would have a double benefit, actually a list of benefits as long as your arm in terms of the economic activity generated, the savings for households and other energy users, the improvement in thermal comfort and human health and safety in what is unfortunately set, however successful we are on emissions reduction, to be increasingly prevalent extreme temperature conditions during our summers, and to help to reduce emissions and increase the resilience of our electricity system as it absorbs more and more cheap but variable renewables. So there's a lot that we can do there, and we're encouraged by the early responses that we are seeing from various governments to those proposals. We will have more to say about this, and we are working in many alliances and partnerships on this. We hope to have a set of policy statements about policy beyond the pandemic across many areas, but certainly a big paper on energy and climate in the coming month. And I might throw back to you, Anna.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tennant. What a gift to our audiences. Thank you, both Adair and Tennant, for really detailed and up-to-the-minute insights from the perspective of industry in relation to the topic that's dear to all our hearts of decarbonisation. So thank you. I'm happy to now jump into some questions and discussion, and hoping that our staff can unmute Adair and Tennant, and we'll curate a dialogue between us. Questions have begun to flow in, and keep them coming, folks. Adair, in a moment, I'm going to ask you, there were a bunch of questions around the border tax adjustments in particular, and I'll come to that. But before I do, and while Tennant's still on the screen, both Adair and Tennant discussed demand more generally, and you talked about the economic downturn. There's actually a question about demand for the green product, the decarbonised steel that Adair discussed, decarbonised cement and the like. And the question was, where is the demand? What's the source of that demand? Is it government policy? Is it industrial demand? Is it corporate procurement policy? And I wonder if Adair can be prepared in a moment to answer that from obviously the European perspective, potentially Chinese. And Tennant, to you, more broadly, do you see such demand in Australia? And if so, from where? And how might it be affected by the current downturn in demand?
So there are a bunch of ways to potentially create demand for cleaner products, and I think we're going to need all of them. The public procurement option it's both an important one, but there's also some challenges with it, in that at the moment there are multiple demands being made or being readied for public procurement to advance a number of agendas. So we've been hearing a lot about the need for, or the desire for, greater local production capability for a number of essential or potentially essential products and materials and services. In the light of the disruptions to international supply chains that we've seen during the different phases of the COVID pandemic. If governments seek to build that up through creating public procurement preferences for local supply, there are complications to that, but there's a cost implication to that as well. There's similar calls to build local capability in the circular economy through adding a public procurement dimension there. And we could be adding requirements for a preference for zero emissions or low emissions, or negative emissions for that matter, materials in public construction projects. The challenge is going to be how much public procurement budgets prepared to push all of these things at once. There may be ways to I don't want to say kill two birds with one stone, but to sustain multiple agendas if local manufacturers can set themselves up to meet this potential demand and provide local supply security. But I don't think that public procurement is going to be able to solve everything. Private demand is an increasingly, I think, important source here. So there are many businesses that are making commitments about supply chain emissions and Scope 3 emissions. And I think that there will be, in tandem with the visibility of the cleaner products that are emerging, I think that there will be more of what we've seen, for instance, from Apple's deal with Alcoa and Alcan to supply zero emissions aluminium for its products starting over the next couple of years.
Yes, and that's a good segue to hear from Adair about the demand side. Adair, where do you see that in the initiatives that you've been involved with across industry, corporate or government?
Well, both with the aluminium industry and with steel, we have been discussing the balance between the public policy lever of either regulation or carbon pricing versus the voluntary green demand pull through from the end consumer, or from the business company which buys the steel or aluminium, which then sells it to the end consumer. And I think there is a potential significant role for that green product demand, but we must also not overstate it or believe that it can ever be sufficient in itself without the public policy. The essential economics is that when you decarbonize something like steel, although you will almost inevitably add to the cost of producing a ton of steel, when you get down to the consumer product, the impact of doing it in a green way on the end consumer product is relatively trivial. To give you an example, if by decarbonizing steel, you end up having to add 25% to the cost of a ton of steel sold from a steel company to an automotive company, if all of that is passed through to the end consumer, you will only increase the cost of the auto that the end consumer buys by well less than 1%, maybe 0.5%. And of course, if that change in relative prices leads to the auto manufacturer working out how to use a little less steel because it's got more expensive relative to some other product, it will be even less than that. So that makes people think, can't we persuade the auto manufacturers to say, this is a car made in a green fashion, confident that even if there is a marginal difference in the price, and it will be less than 1%, the marketing benefit of that will outweigh that small additional cost. And those discussions are going on with the automotive companies. I can tell you there are steel companies which have made zero carbon commitments in Europe, talking with automotive companies about that. I think that is possible. And what we tend to see is that working best with products where the value, the cost of the input is a very small part of the final product. So that Terence has already mentioned the Apple initiative with Alcoa, where the idea is that they will make a commitment to zero carbon aluminium. And of course, the impact of that, of going zero carbon and aluminium on the cost of an Apple mobile phone is so small that they can make that commitment. We've also seen actually Nespresso with a Rio Tinto committing to responsibly sourced aluminium going into those little Nespresso capsules, the little bit of aluminium which is there. And in a sense, that's the easy bit, because you're dealing with products where the metal input, or whatever the high carbon input, is a very, very small part. It gets more complicated in some other sectors of the economy. The impact on the end consumer in all heavy industries is small, but sometimes it gets a bit bigger. Let's take cement. If you end up decarbonizing cement, our calculation is that on some circumstances, that could add 3% to the cost of building a building structure. And there, 3% is just getting to the level where certainly if you were a construction company bidding for a contract, you couldn't simply say, I'm going to take a 3% hit, and so be it, I absorb that. So you need the absolute end buyer of that product to be able to say, I'm willing to accept a slightly higher cost burden. Now, in case of cement, that might well be public procurement has a role to play. And I think we are beginning to see public procurement contracts that say, yes, we want zero carbon cement or zero carbon steel in public contracts. I think the good news when you look at cement is there are so many opportunities in the construction industry to use cement and concrete in a more efficient fashion, that if we did have a slightly higher price of cement in the chain, we would actually unleash a whole load of energy efficiency improvements. But in the cement and construction area, it probably should be it may need to be led by the public sector, though you could also imagine things like luxury hotel chains saying all our hotels are built in a zero carbon fashion as part of the sort of promise to the end consumer. So look, the way I think about this is a lever. It will work on some products. It will work with companies which have strong external brands. Automotive companies may be selling, luxury car brands will, have the confidence to say, I'm making you a promise of zero carbon steel. And hidden within your price of your auto is a minute increase in cost, but you are buying zero carbon a product as a result of that. But as you can see, I see this as an ancillary tool. I don't think it can replace the more robust long-term pool of either regulation or a carbon price to make sure it happens. And I think across all of the heavy industry sectors, most of the industry sees green products as ancillary to the public policy route, but we need the public policy route as well.
Well, that's a good link, I think, to turn to the border tax questions, border tax adjustments. And when you spoke about those earlier, there were a lot of audience members interested in that. So perhaps if you might just provide a bit of an update of where is that up to, the border tax discussion, and what might the next steps be? For example, when would you see them being implemented?
Well, the answer is I can't give you a firm date on that. It is subject to continual discussions in the UK, in Europe at the moment. And what we are doing in the European Net Zero Steel Initiative is really work with the European steel industry, which includes people like ArcelorMittal, Tata Steel in Europe, Salzgitter Hybrid, on the details of how that would work. Now, and I mean, step one is, broadly speaking, the European steel industry has made a commitment to get to net zero, and has made that commitment contingent on a carbon price which creates a level playing field between them, and border tax adjustments or other forms of protection if these carbon prices cannot be applied elsewhere. Meanwhile, the European Union has basically said that it is very interested in these issues. So the process is now engaging on the details, including the details of some of the things. I was just looking at the Q&A, and I think they were very, very good questions by some people in the Q&A, which is, well, how does this really work? How do you know the carbon intensity of a steel import? You know, how into the weeds of the detail do you have to get to trace through how that ton of steel was actually produced? That's one problem you've got to answer. Another problem you have to answer is, if you're going to apply it to a ton of steel, how far down the finished product route do you go? Do you have to say, well, if I applied it to a ton of steel coming from Russia or Turkey, do I have to apply it to a car being imported from Russia or Turkey? Because otherwise, you know, the auto manufacturers are going to be at a disadvantage from cheaper steel cheaper cars with steel in them coming from Russia or Turkey, even if the steel is more expensive. And I think what is emerging there is an idea that there has to be a bit of sort of rough justice, and as it were, the burden of proof is going to be on the country which isn't applying a carbon tax. You sort of have to say, we are going to apply a tax at the border on imports of steel to countries which don't have a carbon tax, and we will set them at a level which has a bias to be perhaps a bit too high, unless you help us prove that your steel is lower carbon than we thought it was. You have to have a bias in the system which protects your domestic players. I think on the finished product route, you simply have to have a pragmatic approach. For instance, in the case of automotive, by the time you've got to the end production of a car, it is very unlikely that, given a very small difference in the cost of the steel input, that is going to trigger a change in the location of car manufacturing, given the huge importance of car manufacturing, of just-in-time inventory systems, developed supply chains, etc. So you can be fairly confident that you can apply a border tax adjustment on steel without that triggering an entire relocation of the automotive industry. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is semi-finished products. You know, when you go from steel ingots to various forms of worked out semi-finished steel products. So all I can say is I can't give you a timeline for when we're going to end this process, but because all of those debates are now engaged in a serious fashion, I think there is just an unstoppable path which is going to take us in this direction. And it's going to take us in this direction because it's going to have to. So if you look at the Swedish steel producer Hybrid, who have made an absolute commitment that they are going to be a zero carbon steel producer by about 2042, using the hydrogen reduction route, and they will be opening the first of their hydrogen direct reduction routes in about 2026, and then slowly closing their blast furnaces and moving to hydrogen thereafter. They have also effectively said to the Swedish government, we are going to be a zero carbon steel producer, but you'll have to decide whether we're going to be a zero carbon steel producer of no steel or a zero carbon steel producer of 10 million tons of steel. Because unless you help us with a carbon price and, if necessary, some border tax adjustments, we'll be zero carbon, but all the steel in Sweden will be imported from Russia or Turkey. So I think the conjecture in Europe of the fact that the European steel industry is making those contingent commitments to be zero carbon, but requiring help from the policymakers, the fact that the policymakers are engaged in it, means that although there are lots of complicated issues on the route from A to B, I'm pretty confident that within the next 2 years, we will have a timescale clearly set out, which is going to take us towards significant carbon prices with some category of border tax adjustment.
Can I add something there, which is from an Australian perspective? We often see, and I think some people in the comments may have given this view, that is Australia going to face a punitive border carbon adjustment on our products unless we get our act together in one or more aspects of climate policy? And I've spent some time on carbon border adjustments. I've had a paper on them that's been stuck at 75% completion for a long time now as events keep overtaking it. And it seems to me, from both my understanding of international trade law and the conversations that I've had with business groups and government officials from the EU, it seems to me that a carbon border adjustment that actually gets agreed and implemented and sticks around, it could absolutely be practical and effective in producing that level playing field. It's probably not going to be a punitive adjustment, but rather one that ensures that there's no extra advantage derived by dint of not having a climate policy. It's quite likely then that if the EU succeeds in developing and implementing this carbon border adjustment, it's not going to be something that whacks Australia specifically or other countries specifically, but that actually provides an example of how the competitiveness concerns that have been in Australia as much as in Europe, one of the top qualms that industry has had about ambitious climate policy, that those concerns actually can be successfully managed and that you can make the transition economically workable as well as technically workable. So all eyes will be on Europe as it works through those practical issues. I think they are actually eminently resolvable, and the thinking evident from the French officials, who have been some of the most active drivers of that proposal, their headspace is very much in the practical implementation side of it, not just statement making. German officials and German companies, because of their much greater trade share of their economy, are more cautious and to be convinced. But there is a good case that can be made to them, and it seems to be being made.
Can I make one other comment, Anna? And it sort of links this issue of border tax adjustments with green steel. There is another way to go, which is to, and I wouldn't exclude that this occurs as well, which is to impose pricing or a regulation at the downstream product level. What I mean by that is, people don't often concentrate on the fact is, Europe already has a very large carbon price applied in the transport sector to diesel and gasoline. But we don't have issues about border tax adjustment because we apply it at the downstream level. We apply it at the pump, a gasoline and diesel price, and that gasoline and diesel price applies to gasoline and diesel, whether it came out of a refinery, somewhere in Britain or in the European Union or in America or Saudi or wherever. Because it's applied at downstream, you just don't have these issues. And you can think about the same thing in regulation. So in Europe, we are seeing increasing demand that end products prove, for instance, that they are made in a responsible fashion. I think we're going to see this in the battery business, an increasing demand that batteries can prove that they are not based on cobalt supplies using child labor in Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. I think we're going to see within the end product space an increasing regulation focused on making sure that products are being recycled. And when you realize that, it's quite possible for the European Union or for the UK and in Britain to pass a regulation that just says all automobiles have to be made from zero carbon steel by a particular date. And if you can't prove that they are zero carbon steel, we are going to apply an additional tax on you, the automotive producer, rather than having to go upstream into the steel industry. So I wouldn't exclude that as part of the way forward, which ties this issue of the green product to the carbon price and the more upstream solutions.
Thank you. This conversation could continue another hour, I'm sure, but we've come to the end of our hour. And I think that's a sign, heads up to our ClimateWorks staff, that we will host further discussions on these industry transitions. There's the green steel discussion. Adair has been accelerating in Australia with a number of papers published, most recently from the Grattan Institute. The hydrogen opportunities that you raised are also being actively explored by state and federal governments under the National Hydrogen Strategy. And we've already seen announcements in the pandemic time about further investments in that area. And we've filled our time with this really interesting discussion around how might, with combination of policy and demand and potentially international tax adjustments, come to fruition. And I think you've both really helped bring it to life for the audience. And it proved such a juicy topic that we haven't had time for the many other conversations. So never mind, because we will continue this dialogue every fortnight. And there were a number of questions in relation to electric vehicles and transport. So we can hold those over and talk again in 2 weeks with a different set of audiences. And I can reassure our ClimateWorks friends that we have a great relationship with Adair Turner. We're collaborating with his Energy Transitions Commission. And so I'm quite confident this will not be the last time that we can hear from Adair, made more easily by the fact that you can Zoom in rather than have to fly for 24 hours to join us. So I think we've certainly struck gold here on this topic, and it's a pleasure for us, as Tennant would know, the policy boffins in this world who study this in depth. It's a pleasure to know that the audiences are also as interested in it as we are. And I know one of the reasons for that is because you've been able to show how we make it real and how there is momentum that can be built on around the world to make the most of the technological opportunities to help us secure a safe climate for us all. So thank you, Adair and Tennant, on behalf of ClimateWorks and our audiences and stakeholders. To those of you in the audience, thank you for the really terrific questions. Do watch your emails for the recording that you'll be sent, and also for information on how to register for our next discussion, which is on transport transitions with EV Council and Australia Post, and that is in a fortnight on the 10th of June. So I'll just close by thanking our ClimateWorks staff, Rob Kelly, who opened today from our Pathways and Investment Program, and our behind the scenes production team, in particular Lilith and Sophie, who've been our technical hosts today. We've had over 250 people in the event audience today, after many hundreds registered. So thank you to you all for your interest and your questions. It gives me confidence about our work in taking forward decarbonisation and harnessing the opportunities. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.